If we can throw up what we had on there last week real quick before we get into the word today. This year we're believing that God is making new roads and new rivers. And we're continuing to talk about what this means. And this is our declaration of our belief based on Isaiah 43. That this will be my best year yet. I cannot wait to see all the Lord will do. I choose to forget what's behind and look forward to the new year with expectation. I believe the Lord will do something new this year. He will pour out rivers of provision in the desert and pave roadways of vision through the wilderness. I will follow him this year and go wherever he leads. Father, we do desire this year, as we think about what is to come and what is to be this year, we're beginning with a mindset to believe that you have something exciting, not only as a church, but just in our own personal lives and our personal faith journey with you. Isaiah wrote these words to encourage a group of people in a season of wilderness, in a season into which they found themselves beat up, discouraged. Is there anything? Is there hope? And while we look back and we remember, we need help, Holy Spirit, that as we remember, we don't remain, but that we allow what we take away from the remembrance to be that you are faithful and you will make a way. And so we live this year with the expectation that you're going to do something new and fresh and exciting. And we can't wait to see what that is. And so help us this morning as we continue to understand what it means to see that there is in fact distractions. And we need to be able to help focus on you in the midst of the distractions. You're the source. We desire to flow out of the source and not just rely on a system. And so help us to see what that looks like today. In Jesus' name, amen. I wanted to quickly just recap a few thoughts with you, if I may, just to kind of bring us up to date. If 1 week you missed a thought or missed something, and so I thought I would just recap a few of the things that we had looked at in these last couple of weeks in Isaiah 43. And so we began to talk about what it means to forget the past, and we unpacked that a little bit to come to these couple points that I had made. Number one, we can't be hungry for tomorrow if we're full of yesterday. We can't be hungry for tomorrow if we're full of yesterday. And so we need an appetite for what God is doing today. We focused on this word. God said, I am doing a new thing. And so we talked about then how we can look at what God has done, what I did, and then look at what he is doing. And so God is more concerned not about what is behind you. He's concerned about what is before you. Because what is before you is what God is unfolding. The past is already the past. It's behind us. But what God is most concerned about is where are you going? What will you be doing? And he is wanting to help prepare you for those moments. And so we unpacked about this idea of I am doing. And then last Sunday, what we looked at was these three things about pursuing the gift giver, preparing with expectancy, and perceiving the new. And we're going to kind of continue to talk along the lines of this morning of what does it mean to prepare and what does it mean to perceive the new. And it all does stem back from the pursuit of the person. And it's so important that we never lose sight of what it means to pursue after God. We can never keep our eyes off of Him. We're always pursuing, we're always going after and trying to see and to seek what is God in fact doing. One of the scriptures that I read this week as we just begin was 2 Corinthians 5:17. And what that reminds us of is that we have to live by faith and not by sight. We see by faith. We don't see by physical sight. And so if we're going to believe of what God wants to do this year in our life, we have to walk by faith. We have to walk with spiritual eyes and not physical eyes, because if we're going to see what God is doing, it may not look like what we anticipated. It may not feel like what we thought. And so we have to, in fact, walk by faith and not walk by sight. I wanted to share with you a quick, and I went back and forth whether I was going to show this video or just share it. And I remember I shared this with Tiffany, and she was like, well, you should have just let me watch the video. And I said, I know, and too late. And so I don't have the video. I'm just going to describe to you something that I had read this week. It was a study done by a researcher in the field of psychology that was called visual cognition. And in this experiment, what was conducted was called the invisible gorilla. Has anyone ever heard of this before? The invisible gorilla? All right. Anyone else? People maybe have heard of this called the invisible. This was done years and years ago. I mean, when I watched the video, I was like, what? But maybe sometime after I explain it, go and just watch so you can get the idea of what this experiment was done. By the man that did it, his name was Daniel Simons. So the experiment was set up this way. There was two groups of people, some in white t-shirts and some in black t-shirts, and what they were doing was passing a basketball between them as they moved around. And so in the midst of these sequences, as the ball was passing, what Daniel had was he had a man in a gorilla suit walk through the middle, just simply walk through the middle of all this going on in the sequence of the ball being passed. And what observers had to do was count how many times the men and women in white t-shirts passed the ball to each other. So the whole time what you're doing is you're counting every time they would pass the ball to a person in the white t-shirt. And so in the middle of it, as you're counting, he has this gorilla just walk through. And when the experiment was done, they asked them how many times did the ball get passed, and then the second question was, who saw the gorilla? And 50% of the people, when they did the study, 50% of the people said, what gorilla? 50%. I went on and watched it just to, and I mean, I was like, how'd you miss that? It would have been funny to have it and see if anyone actually did miss it, because 50% of people didn't see the gorilla. And then some of us were like, well, how did you not see it? But the point of the study was to show this, that perceptions of reality are contingent on the mode of attention. Perceptions of reality are contingent on our mode of attention. And while this was a study done with psychology, I was thinking about this and I'm like, man, that is a sermon. Because what we are prepared to focus on will determine what we see. What we are prepared to focus on will give the determination of what we see. I want to talk about that today. About the perception is contingent on attention. And if we're going to perceive, this is what Isaiah 43, Isaiah is telling us, if we're going to perceive, if there's going to be perception, Some other translations, when they use Isaiah 43:19, now do you not see it? It springs forth, do you not see it? In other words, are you not taking heed to what's already happening? So in other words, as you would look at this picture of the men and women that are passing the basketball, and then the gorilla kind of passes through, God is the gorilla, not the basketball. Because if God was the basketball, in other words, the basketball represents what we can control. The basketball represents what we can move around, what we can see happen. But in the experiment, God represents the gorilla. God is the person that is cutting through what you're doing and asking, are you going to see it? Are you going to experience it? And most people, and 50% of the people in the study never saw the gorilla. And I often wonder, even in the spiritual context, how often we miss seeing God move because we're not prepared to see. I've been there, and possibly you've been there. That there's things God is doing in your life, and you're focused on everything else, and you're trying to do everything else and keep track of this and keep track of that. Well, in the midst of that, God is moving and God's cutting through your life in the scene and saying, hey, I want you to perceive me, I want you to see me, but our focus is on something else. And so I just want to ask you a question. Is there a distraction that you need to remove from your life that will help you focus more on what God is doing? And can I tell you, that even means good things. And that's what's unique about Isaiah 43, is that what God was telling the people to not keep looking back on was one of the most profound experiences of Israel, the parting of the Red Sea. I mean, this was like the moment every person remembered and looked back on. And so, it's not only the bad stuff that we have to forget, it's also sometimes that our minds can become so attentive to even the good things that are going on in our life that we can say, well, this is all I need. And so, even sometimes we have to ask ourselves, what could even be a good thing that is distracting me from keeping focus on what God is doing? I'm going to dive into a few scriptures here with you real quick to kind of help us catch some of these things that can happen. Look up Luke chapter 8, verse 7. Luke chapter 8, verse 7. And so this is this parable of the soils. Jesus is talking about when the farmer goes and he casts in the seeds, and he talks about the different soils it lands on. In verse 7, I just wanted to look at this specific one. It said, seed fell among thorns that, get this, that grew up with the plant and choked out the other plant. So, in other words, sometimes we've been talking about this concept that there is the seed of the kingdom, and there's a seed in your life, and that picture of it springs forth. And we looked at last week about Isaiah 41, how there's going to be trees planted in the wilderness, that God is about to turn your barrenness into bountifulness. And so there's this springing forth up. And when we talk about spring, how I love the season of spring when things begin to grow and there's new life and there's freshness, and when there's a seed that begins to sprout. Jesus said this is how sometimes when the word falls into someone's life, along with the word that is planted as a seed as it grows, there's also these thorns that grow right along with it. And as it grows right along with it, it eventually takes the source of the plant. And so the question simply is there something else that is growing up with you that is distracting or taking away from what God is trying to do in your life? Look at John chapter 9. There's a lot of these that we could look at in the life of Jesus, but I just wanted to pick apart a couple of them. You see, we touched base on this a couple of weeks ago, how Israel, as the people journeyed to the promised land, remember this? And it says that all they could think about was all the food they had in Egypt. The world in Egypt, Egypt, if you look at it in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, Egypt is this picture. It represents the way of the world. Oftentimes God tells his people, don't look to Egypt, don't turn to Egypt. In the New Testament, there's references about Egypt, because Egypt represents, for the New Testament understanding, Egypt represents the way of the world. And God is telling us the way of the world is not the promise of God. And so we have to, as we're journeying to the promise, the world is set up to distract you from God. The world is set up to distract us. I mean, I could talk about this in so many different ways, into which the world, everything in the structure of how the world is established and the way that we operate and live, it's all set up to distract you from God. It's to keep you from God's purpose, to keep you from God's plans, to keep you from what God wants for you. Everything is set up to distract us. Because who is in control of the world? Who was it that was put down and cast into the earth? It was Satan. And so, until Christ comes and sets up the new heaven and new earth, there's always going to be a place in the world that distracts you from what God is doing in your life. And you have to be able to perceive and to see what God's doing. And the only way we can do that is if we're focused on Him and not focused on the basketball, that we can easily control ourselves while God is coming through, and you can't control what He does, but He wants you to see what He's doing so that we can take part in it. And so look at this, John chapter 9, verse 13. And so they took the man who had been blind, the Pharisees, because it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. The Pharisees asked the man all about it, and so he told them, "He put the mud over my eyes, and when I was washed away, I could see." But then look at verse 16. But some of the Pharisees said, so just stop there for a second. A man who they knew was blind comes to them and he says, "Hey, this dude named Jesus put mud in my eyes and now I can see." Like, I think just maybe you would stop for a second and think, whoa, dude, what just happened? If some guy came into our church that you knew was blind and then now could see, would you just be like, "Hey, cool"? Or would you be like, "Man, that is awesome"? I think even in the midst of Jesus working miracles today, we don't perceive it because we don't believe it. We don't believe that Jesus can do this or that this could actually happen. And so I think we miss so much in our world because the world is set up to distract you from believing the supernatural. We just have to explain it somehow. The world wants to explain everything. Sometimes you got to be like the man who had mud in his eyes and just say, "Hey, I don't know what this man did, but he put some mud in my eyes, and all of a sudden I can see." There ain't no scientific reasoning. I simply see. But you know what the Pharisees said? All they could focus on, look at verse 16. "This man is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath." Holy smokes! This Jesus can't be the Messiah because he would know better to work on the Sabbath. You don't do that. You don't go out to eat on the Sabbath. You don't do this on... I grew up in a religious world of people who always said, you don't do this on Sunday. And I'm just like, for real? Man. I was like, why? I mean, Jesus did stuff on the Sabbath. Jesus healed on the Sabbath. So why do we live with that mentality? It's because there's still the spirit of the Pharisee in the church today. And so we can't believe it because why? Well, Jesus would know better not to do that. But can I tell you, they weren't going to talk the man out of believing what this guy did or believing he was the Messiah. Your testimony of his faithfulness and his power is all you need. Another story in the Old Testament, I won't have you turn there, but I don't know why I've shared this now this week twice, and I just felt the Spirit just keeps saying we just need to keep it coming. In the Old Testament, when Moses told them, he sent 12 spies into the Promised Land to see what were the people like, what were the cities like, what was the food like, what was the land like. And he said, go in there and do all this. This is Numbers 13 and 14. He says, go in there and see all this and then come back and just give us a report. And so these 12 go into the land and they come back out. 10 of them come back and say, hey, yes, there was all of this stuff, but we shouldn't do this. Moses wasn't asking them to give them a conclusion of what they should do. He just simply said, come back and tell me what you see. But they took it under their belt to say, hey, we already made the decision for you. We shouldn't do this. And yet 2 of them were like, we can do this, and we should, because why? God's already told us the promise. We can do it. And in Numbers 14 it says they spent the whole night wailing and complaining and crying that we shouldn't do it. It's amazing how the voice of negativity can be so strong. And so, as I was thinking about this, one of the things that just began to depress on me is that how often we will use fear to disguise it as wisdom. They had fear, but they used it to say, hey, we're wise. We shouldn't do this. We can use fear to disguise as wisdom. And so what happens is that then we begin to invest the promise that God has given and spoken. We begin to determine whether or not we can do it based on the faithlessness of people instead of the faithfulness of God. Many dreams, many things in your life, you may get a vision from God that says you're going to do this, and then you share that with a friend of yours, and your friend has no faith, and your friend says, oh, you can't do that. You shouldn't even try. And so what do? You don't try. Because we give the promised vision that God spoke. Remember this, God spoke, and you entrust it into someone who has no faith. And you ask them, should I do this? Well, no, you shouldn't ask them if you should do it. They have no faith. And even in your life, even in the life of the church, we often depend on what we accomplish and do based on people who come back and have no faith that we can do it, and we decide we can't do it. I've seen it happen so many times in church life. They get a vision from God, but then they say, oh, but there's people who say we can't do it, so we can't do it. And I always ask, who told you to do it, God or them? Well, God. Well, then do it. If God has told you, do it. God told Moses, this is the promised land for you. I'm going to give it to you. It's already yours. Do you perceive it? It's already coming. But you don't see it because why? Because they depended upon voices of people who didn't believe they could do it. And so there may be people in your life that you simply may not need to share things with because they don't have the faith to believe it with you. And sometimes God shows me things that I can't share with people because they're not ready to hear it yet, because they don't have the faith that's going to help me also continue to believe it. Does that make sense? So that's one of the things that I believe can distract us is that there can be good traditions, and then there can be also traditions and customs that we follow. But because we do that, Jesus said, you guys can't receive it. You don't see it. Because I did something that was opposite of what you believe to be the only way. And we also find this in Mark chapter 7, which Tony already taught on in Sunday school, so I don't even have to go over it. You can get his notes. But Jesus brought a complete new structure of thinking. And yet, countless times, the people never got it because it didn't fit into what they thought it should be. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we see it? Are we going to perceive it? And one of the things that can distract us is those customs and traditions that we have followed for so long. Another distraction can simply be when we're content. We're not hungry, we're satisfied. I think about maybe if you're hiking a mountain and you get to a plateau point. You've been hiking for so long, you get to that plateau and you feel, you look up and you're like, well, we could keep going, or I do feel pretty good from what I've done now, I'll just stop. And then you begin to go back down. You reach a certain point where you say, I'm good. I've accomplished something. And yet God has so much more for you to do, but those plateaus, you lose thirst, you lose hunger, and you simply say, I'm going back down. That may be a distraction. Another one might be when you're fearful about the future. You become comfortable of what seems safe. One of the statements I always make to people is that uncertainty is the greatest weakness to God's new and fresh move in your life. Uncertainty. Uncertainty cripples. Uncertainty paralyzes you. So maybe it's fear that there's something safer, and so that distraction is keeping you from allowing God to show you something new in your life. Open up to Matthew 14. This is the last picture I want to see, and it really just came to me this morning, trying to understand this. You probably know this story of the disciples in the boat. And a storm is coming. The disciples look out over the water and they see this man who is walking. They're fighting the heavy waves. Matthew 14, and so I'm just picking up some bits and pieces here. But in verse 26 it says the disciples, they saw him walking on the water and they were terrified. And in their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." They believed it was a ghost. I want you to get that. They believed what was on the water was a ghost. This shaped some things to me this morning. It says, but Jesus spoke to them. Don't be afraid, take courage. I am here. Now, in this simple dialogue of what Jesus says, couldn't a ghost say the same thing? They still don't know it's Jesus yet. Just because the thing speaks doesn't mean they now believe it's all of a sudden Jesus. Because what does Peter say? Peter says, if it is really you, if it's really you, tell me to come out. Well, couldn't a ghost also say, come out? Yes. So they're still not convinced. But the Father showed me something this morning. As I told you, I really did not feel like there was something in me. It was like, I'm not feeling it. And as I was reading this story, as Peter says, if it's really you, tell me to come to you and to walk on the water. And Jesus says, yes, come. And so Peter is the one that gets out of the boat. He begins to walk on the water, and you know what happens. He sees the waves, and he gets distracted, and he begins to sink, and he cries out. We know that story, and so we think about this distraction. But here's what hit me this morning. Is that Jesus talked about in John 15:15, he says, I have called you friends, and I have revealed to you the things my Father has revealed to me. Such a powerful image. Jesus says, I don't want to call you slaves, I call you friends, and my friends I share with what the Father shows me. That's a good friend. I'm telling you, not every friend of mine would I share everything with. There's some friends who are just friends, and then there's some friends who are friends, if that makes sense. There's certain friends, and Jesus said, I called you friend because I'm going to reveal to you what the Father, that's some heavy stuff. But the only way you can receive what the Father is showing is if Jesus calls you a friend. Which means when Jesus tells Peter to come out on the water, is it really you? In that moment, something hit Peter deep down, and he believed this is Jesus. This is Jesus. You have to know in the depths of who you are that the Father is really calling you. I don't have an answer. It doesn't say here, it just simply says that Peter said, okay, I'm coming. But I believe with all my heart that in this moment something spoke to Peter deep down. And he knew, this is Jesus. And when you know it's Jesus, you can't stay in the boat. When you really experience the voice of Jesus, the life-giving, changing voice, you can't stay in the boat. But you have to be able to perceive the voice. Because even another voice could simply tell you the same thing. Still not convinced, I'm going to stay in the boat. But I believe with all my heart when it's Jesus speaking to you, you'll know it. And your obedience will follow. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's not safe, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it's not tradition, you will follow Jesus. And there's things, I don't know if I should even say this, maybe I shouldn't. I grew up in the church all my life. I've grown up in the Nazarene church now the last 9 years. This year, 9 years since I've been a pastor in the Nazarene church. I love the Nazarene church. But even in the midst of being a part of a great denomination, and I say this lightly because there's things even in tradition of Nazarene denomination that we don't necessarily condone or necessarily follow or practice. It isn't that we say it's not biblical, we just don't do it. And so even in the midst of that, there's times where God will begin to show you things about your ministry and your life that you're like, well, it's not like I'm going to get in trouble and have to go sit down with the GS and get my license taken away. But it also won't make people smile upon you, if that makes sense. And so we can live with a sense of fear that, well, God, are you really saying? Because we have put God into the Nazarene box. We've put God into the Methodist box. I mean, any denomination has done it. We put God in some box because this is how it has to be. I'm not saying all of it's bad, but I'm saying sometimes God begins to reveal things in your life that is going to, in other words, rock the boat where you have to get out. Peter had to get out of the boat. And God's been showing me some things about my ministry that's like, God, that doesn't really necessarily fit with every Nazarene church I've been associated with. Are you sure? He said, yes. And so there may be things in that realm that we have to sit back and we have to ask, if Jesus is really speaking, I believe with all my heart you'll know it and you'll follow. And that may mean getting out of the boat of comfort, getting out of the boat of safety, and saying, I'm going to be obedient. I don't even know why, but I'm going to be obedient. Because he's going to show you, because why? It's springing forth. Do you not see it? It's already happening. There's things already in your life happening that you don't even see yet. Because you have kept your eyes from seeing, because you're not sure. You're uncertain. Can this really be? I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying if we will allow the one who has given the vision, the one who has spoken into your life to lead you, we don't have to be afraid. And so the statement I want to leave you with, I want you to really hone in on this. Before you can step into your fulfillment, you must be in alignment with the Father's heart. Before you can step into the fulfillment, you must be in the alignment with the Father's heart. That's the only alignment you need in your life, is the Father's heart. Some people may get it, some may not. But as long as you are living in alignment with the Father's heart, and this means that you are seeking after him, you're his friend, Jesus is revealing the things of the Father to you, he's downloaded it into your heart, he's given it to you. And when you receive that, that's your focus. I'm going to focus on what the Father is showing me in this season of my life. It may not look like what other people thought it was going to look like. It may not feel like what people thought it was going to feel like. But I'm going to be obedient because the Father is giving it to me. Paul said what? I'm not trying to win the approval of man. If I was trying to win the approval of man, I would not be a servant of God. I am here to hear from the Father. And sometimes that sounds mean, doesn't it? I'm not here to win your approval. But it's not meant to be taken as some kind of attack. Because if all of us were living that way, we would all be in alignment with the Father's heart. We'd all be hearing and seeing as the Father is giving. And so that's my challenge to you this morning, is simply get into the alignment with the Father's heart. And one way you can do this is to move towards Jesus. Move towards Jesus. Can you do that? Can you just simply this morning say, I'm going to move towards Jesus? I want to pursue Jesus, don't you? Amen.